Horror. It's a genre which is synonymous in film, with an ever-growing audience and numerous subgenres which continue to develop. Hi, my name is Amir, and today we will be discussing the history and the evolution of the genre which has terrorized viewers so much. Its infant stage began in the silent era of film, where many early works were adaptations from Gothic literature at the time, as they used gloomy dark settings, usually in places like castles and mansions with supernatural themes. The Manor of the Devil in 1896 is widely regarded as the first horror movie ever. Because of this, many followed suit by using classic literature stories like Frankenstein, the Werewolf, and Dr. Jekyll and Mr. Hyde. This then all gave way to what by many is deemed the golden age of horror. This came with classics such as The Cabinet of Dr. Caligari and Nosferatu, both in the 1920s. And with the introduction of sound to film, horror benefited from it the most, as the music and sound effects added so much to the viewer's experience, delivering that impact which had been missing from the early films. Horror in the 30s continued to still garner popularity, with cinemas and theatres being packed with moviegoers as the genre saw the rise of horror stars and defining versions of horror characters becoming classics like Dracula, Frankenstein, and The Mummy. However, in the 1940s, the genre stagnated, with Hollywood facing major setbacks and new regulations which gave filmmakers barely anything to work with. The 1950s were known as the atomic years, as the world had seen the chaos around nuclear weapons. This ushered a wave of movies which would incorporate extraterrestrial beings and atomic monsters like Godzilla. During this time, American filmmakers would use gimmick thrills in cinemas by using 3D, placing buzzers under the seat, and even promising $1,000 in insurance cover if anyone died of fright during the film. While all of this was going on, British filmmakers like Alfred Hitchcock developed the Hammer horror genre as it focused on gore, sex, and violence. These were different from the early movies in the genre, as they delivered real terror which could easily happen to the audience, also initiating the slasher genre as it included stalkers, killers, and the abuse of power. Nearing the end of the 1960s, George A. Romero created The Night of the Living Dead, which brought a new type of threat forth, being zombies. Horror in the 1970s continued to evolve. The main subgenre which spearheaded the decade was slasher, as films like The Texas Chainsaw Massacre and Halloween further broadened the scope of what you could make in a horror. But it wasn't just slashers which run the decade, as the occult type of horror also was reignited, with additional classics such as The Exorcist, The Omen, and the Amityville Horror. The decade also saw a surge of animal horrors, where the threat would be different carnivorous mammals. The main contributor who began this onslaught of animal slasher horror movies was Steven Spielberg with Jaws. In the 1980s, slashers remained as the leading subgenre in this decade too, with classics such as A Nightmare on Elm Street, Child's Play, and lastly, Friday the 13th. Due to these films' success, they spawned many reboots, sequels, and with the birth of individual franchises making large-scale revenue as the characters were adored by horror fans. CGI and special effects had also massively improved in this decade, with films such as The Thing, which captivated audience with strange creatures which would have not been possible earlier in the genre. Another defining title which had also stood the test of time is The Shining by Stanley Kubrick in 1980. In the 1990s, horror began to calm down, as the audience were getting very used to the conventions of the genre, with filmmakers deciding to play on this by being self-aware and almost satire at times, with Scream in 1996 working as one of the first in the genre to do so. Horror had severely stagnated in quality during the 2000s, as the plots remained formulaic like the previous decade. Some, however, were exceptions, as we saw the beginning of a few successful horror franchises like Saw. Zombie movies also saw a return in this decade, with classics such as 28 Days Later and Shaun of the Dead. In the 2010s, however, all changed as the genre was revitalized by so many original and terrifying horror movies. This also brought the largest array of subgenres which stood upon the genre which began a whole century ago. One of the most notable from the decade was Jordan Peele's Get Out. This was his directorial debut into filmmaking, and since then, he has become a staple filmmaker in the genre. The demand for horror will continue to grow, and with the surge of streaming sites, it can be very easy to find yourself binging the best horror movies that the genre has to offer. It is also very fair to say that the genre, despite stagnant eras and years, will never die.